Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aralda Goli, and I am the Economic Resiliency Coordinator with the South Florida Regional Planning Council. Thank you so much for joining us on how to get additional flood policy discounts in 2022 and plan for sea level rise mitigation. Is just a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are new to GoToWebinar, it's just like any other platform like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. You're all on mute. Please use the chat box to ask questions. Time permitting, we will try and have our panelists answer them if they can. Please let me know privately or whatever in the chat box if you're having any issues. Also, please note that this meeting is being recorded and we will post it on our website and share it with you after the event is over. And now I'll hand it over to Isabel, our Executive Director at the South Florida Regional Planning Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Cosillo-Carballo. I'm the Executive Director of South Florida Regional Planning Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful meeting with our mayor from Monroe County, our council member, Michelle Coldiron, as well as this incredible staff in Monroe County that's been doing this groundbreaking work that is going to be so useful to everyone to learn about. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Regional Council, our council represents Monroe, Miami-Dade, and Broward counties. We are one of 10 regional planning councils in the state. What is less known is that one year, at the very beginning, our council actually used to include Palm Beach, Martin, and St. Lucie County as well. So what we focus on is long-term planning. We're in that sort of sweet spot between state government and federal and local. And we focus more on issues that are 15 years out, 20 years out, the longer range views. We are an economic development district, which means we are designated by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and with funding support from them, work hand in glove with the DA to prepare grant applications and help our local governments access these economic development resources. We also provide technical assistance, and I certainly hope that everyone by now knows that we have some special revolving loan funds that are assisting COVID impacted businesses, as well as a regular small business fund for businesses that would have a little trouble getting regular financing. Among our other services, you see the slide that Aralda has so kindly prepared. We do emergency preparedness planning. We work on transportation, regional transportation, affordable housing. We work with our partners at the Climate Compact and Resiliency and Sea Level Rise, and we offer a variety of services. And the best thing is you can just call Aralda or come to our website, sfregionalcouncil.org, and you'll find more information there and plenty of people that are happy to help you. So with that, I am delighted to turn the meeting over to Mayor Michelle Coldiron, our council member on the Regional Planning Council. Mayor.
Here we go. Hi, thank you so much. So love being here today, and this is quite an honor for Monroe County to be giving this presentation this afternoon. You know, living in the fabulous Florida Keys makes us the envy of all of our friends up north, and even some of those from other parts of Florida. However, the cost of living in paradise is exorbitant. A trip to the grocery store, the gas station, or a restaurant will quickly show you just how expensive it is to live here in the Florida Keys. And although our tourism business is booming, finding employees is always challenging. Like other parts in the state, we have a shortage of housing, especially for our workforce. And our working class homeowners struggle to make ends meet. The unfunded mandate for Monroe County to switch from septic to sewer in 1999 came with a huge price tag of $1 billion, and it landed squarely on the backs of our home and business owners. The cost of wind and flood insurance continues to rise, adding even more financial obligations for our residents. Luckily for our county, we have a rock star status team. Several years ago, Christine Hurley discovered a federal program called the Community Rating System that would give significant discounts on homeowner insurance premiums based on the grade of our county to keep their county and their community resilient. So it is my honor today to introduce to you the team that keeps the Florida Keys functioning through environmental, financial, and governmental changes and progression. And this team consists of County Staff Assistant County Administrator Christine Hurley, our Director of Legislative Affairs Lisa Tennyson, our Director of Sustainability Rhonda Haig, our Senior Director of Planning and Environmental Resources Emily Schemper, and our consultants Lori Lear and Attorney Aaron Deedy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Rockstar team.
Bravo to our team. Thank you, Mayor.
So I believe that, Emily, we're going to the next, there we go. So the agenda for today, I'm Lori Lear, and I am, as Mayor mentioned, one of the consultants on the presentation today. And what I handled for Monroe County, and I'm still handling, is their participation or implementation of the CRS program. So we're going to talk today about what the community rating system is, for those of you that might not be so familiar with how that works, or at least a little bit about how it works, and what it is, what it's meant to be, and who can participate in the program. Most communities across the nation can participate if they want to, and why local governments should participate. And that'll become pretty clear pretty quick why we should participate, and how local governments can begin down this lane to participate and use Monroe County as kind of the case study. And I'll tell you that I've been working in this for my entire career, which is going on 28 or so years now, and definitely Monroe County is the case study for how to go from rags to riches, or the Cinderella story. I've heard it called all sorts of things, but today we're going to present that to you, and we're getting notoriety for those sorts of terms, and what's next in the program and the NFIP. So first, I'm going to start off the presentation with the community rating system, since that's my area of expertise, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is. It is a complicated program, I will tell you that, just to start off so that you kind of have an idea in your head how this works. It's about 800 pages of a federal program. So it's quite an intricate program to implement in a community. It is a voluntary program, and it is a class rating system. It was originally based upon the fire ratings. So that kind of came out of how we were dealing with fires in our communities and how they were rated. The same company who actually does those ratings is a company that implements this program called ISO, or Insurance Services. And it's based on a total number of points that your community can earn. And as you earn those points, classes are assigned to your community. And those classes indicate the percentage of discount that your policyholders can receive on their flood insurance policies, if they have flood insurance policies issued by the National Flood Insurance Program. So the premiums range from a discount of 5% to 45%. And it is based upon, again, the number of points that you accumulate. And then the number of points and some hefty prerequisites. They sell it as the number of points, but then there are a lot of things that go into that in addition to the number of points. The classes range from a class 9 to a class 1. Class 1 is the best class you can be at that 45% discount. Today, most communities enter the program at a 9 or an 8. So just sort of barely in the program. So put that in your head, because Christine Hurley's going to wow you with another fact about the county here coming up. We engage in some activities that make us eligible to increase those discounts on our NFIP policy. So these discounts actually are shown right on each individual policyholder's policy statement when they get that policy statement each year. So this is something that's a percentage of their total premium. And why does the CRS program do this? They do this because they've set out 3 goals, and that is to reduce flood insurance damages to insurable properties. Obviously, that's coming out of the NFIP program, and to support and strengthen that program because we know lots of flood insurance claims have been paid out over the years, and to encourage a comprehensive approach to floodplain management. So what are the real benefits of the program? Yep, they are to make your insurance lower in this world where insurance is going up and up and up, to get that percentage off. But the reason that they do that, in addition to the goals, is that we get other benefits in our community for that besides just the discount. So citizens or property owners, they can learn about their risks, their vulnerabilities, and they can take action to protect them. In fact, we ask them to in this program. The floodplain management activities, they really do enhance public safety. That's what this is all about. The spread of the activities, as you can see, go all the way from things like elevation certificates, or how are you at risk, to what is your emergency warning system, and what's up on the screen right now are all the different activities and how you can participate. So communities can evaluate their effectiveness in the program. So this is the way they can evaluate their program. What are you doing within these categories that are making you a more resilient community? And obviously, it gives you incentive. You're going to hear about that too, because once you get in the program, not only are you incentivized within your community, but then communities and neighboring communities begin to compete to see how they can do well within this program, which makes all the communities around us more resilient. So this is the 19 type of activities. They're positioned under 3 different series of activities, as you can see, going all the way from public information to flood warning and response. So there are many different ways that you can earn credit. And a lot of these things that you can earn credit for are things that you're already doing in your community. That's the way this is set up. And then as you participate in higher levels, then you have to reach deeper to get some of those additional credits. So now we're going to talk a little bit about who participates in the program. We're going to kind of give you an overview of what that looks like for the state of Florida. So as you can see, we have 3 communities right now that are better than a CRS Class 5. And those communities are cities within the state of Florida. And Monroe County is going to be joining that elite group that is better than a CRS Class 5 on April 1st of 2022. So I didn't say on the last slide, which I neglected really. So CRS, participating in the CRS classes is pretty much point-based until you get to a CRS Class 5. Then you have a really steep mountain to climb because there are a lot of prerequisites, and you're going to hear all about that today. That is where you kind of meet that wall where you're going to have to really commit to being in the program. So when you're talking about being a Class 5, you can see that there are only 43 Class 5s in the entire state of Florida, and 2 of those being a Class 4. And then come April 1, 2022, that number that you see as a Class 3, that will be 2 instead of just 1, because Monroe County will be joining. So there are about 479 total jurisdictions, cities and counties within the state of Florida. And we have about 50% of those that are in the CRS program. But it is worth noting that of those 50%, the top 50, as far as the policies in force or the heavy hitters in the program, the ones that get the most discount on their NFIP policy, that top percent, 100% of them are now in the CRS. So joining that elite group is great, and the state of Florida really has some pretty impressive numbers. And nationally, this might be of some interest to you too. Communities, CRS communities, there's some 22,000 NFIP communities nationwide. Only 5% of those actually participate in the CRS program, but that's about 69% of all flood insurance policies. So the CRS program does have quite a far-reaching implementation, both in Florida and across the United States. All right, I'm gonna hand it to you, Christine.
Good afternoon, everybody. Christine Hurley, Assistant County Administrator for Monroe. And I am going to tell you from my standpoint, the history of the county going into the CRS. And I think it'll be helpful for other communities to hear this, because when you heard Lori talk about a Cinderella story, it was kind of true, although we were definitely one of the wicked stepsisters. We, in the 80s and 90s, really did some terrible things, not implementing our flood regulations. And because of that, we became known in FEMA as a community that's in bad standing. At one point, we were almost required to go on probation and threatened, excuse me, to potentially lose our flood insurance. 1 minute.
Lori, you want to take over for a moment? Unmute yourself.
All right. So as Christine was saying there on the top line, you can see that actually when I came on board in 2015, we were still in bad standing with the NFIP and the flood insurance program. And we had, I think it was over 100 findings that we still were going to have to work through in order to get into good standing with the program in order to join the CRS program. So in late 2015, in fact, it was November, I was cooking Thanksgiving dinner when I got the letter that said, hey, guess what? You're now in good standing and we're inviting you to join the CRS program. So we were actually already ready to go with the application. And so we were able to turn that in. And in 2016, we came into the program as a CRS Class 6. So we were able to really come in guns blazing and get into the program. And then, as I said, you know, once you get in, you want to go forward in the program. Okay, what can we do next? So Christine's vision was every year we were going to go ahead and we're going to improve a class in the CRS program. So in 2017, we had that application all ready to go and turned in, thank goodness, prior to Hurricane Irma. So while we were dealing with Hurricane Irma, we became a CRS Class 5. So that kind of slipped in under the radar because we were busy with other things. So then we were kind of on hold for a little while we were dealing with Hurricane Irma. So that kind of put our plans on hold. Christine, are you ready to deliver the rest of the great news?
I'm going to try.
Okay.
Sorry about that, everybody. So we originally tried, as Lori said, to get to Class 4. And once we had all of our points tabulated, we actually made it to Class 3. So that means an average savings per policy. Next slide. Oh. One more. Okay, never mind. I'll tell you later.
It's right there on the top of the 2020.
That says Class 4.
Yes, that
Okay.
would have. Yep.
It's coming. We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We'll get there. A few more slides.
So I'm going to talk now about what it took us to get started in this, because when you're a local government and you attend a class on and try to learn how to do this on your own, it will kind of overwhelm you. The manual is about 4 inches thick, double-sided, and I can assure you that when you start seeing the application, it will really be a challenge. But the reason you need to really press forward is the benefit to your community, not only savings, but the resiliency that gets built into your community. And the way we did that down here is we had to sell it. We had to sell it to elected officials and community members. So remember when I told you we were in bad standing, and a lot of our electeds were like, we do not like FEMA. We don't want to participate with them in anything. And so we had to actually show what the savings would be and build it up from that perspective. In the county at the time, there were 14,442 policyholders. So immediately you're talking to your elected officials about helping 14,000 households or business owners. 13,000 were residential and about 835 non-residential. The amount of coverage of NFIP was over $3 billion. And the premiums paid by our citizens were over 16 million. When you start talking numbers like this to elected officials, they all of a sudden pay attention. So you really have to show them the big picture first. The other thing that we did is we had a private citizens group in the Keys that were focused on fair insurance rates for Monroe. And they became an advocacy group for us and started talking to realtors, insurance agents, lenders, because those are all of your groups that you have to target for them to understand the benefit. Clearly, if someone gets cheaper flood insurance, they can buy more house. They can pay less insurance. And those industry groups are who you need to go to and meet with and get them excited about this opportunity. We developed one-page handouts and information for them to actually get them engaged so they could start telling the story. And we had the private citizens group do a lot of email blasts out to get people interested in the program. This document is something that each one of you, if you're a local government representative, should go out and try to find for your community. And what it shows you is basically, what if I apply for CRS and I am immediately put in a class 9. You'll see there in Monroe County, if we became a class 9, we would save approximately $75 per policy holder and $1 million for our community. Not a huge amount, right? But start going down that list, looking at a class 5, and all of a sudden you're, oh, I'm saving $373 average annually for my policy holder. And now I'm at 5.3 million for my community. And those are annual amounts. And all of a sudden now it seems a lot more desirable to move up in the scoring. Class 1 is the highest. Like Lori said earlier, we're at class 3 or will be next year based on our score. And that savings is about 522 average per policy. And now we're at 7.5 million total savings for next year. So super important, and our electeds love it. We also, and we think this was one of our major selling points to community members, we took samples of flood insurance bills that people get in the mail. And if you've got your mortgage escrowed, you always don't pay attention to this. But when you start looking at what you're paying annually for insurance, and then we started showing them the discount they would achieve with a class 3 rating or a class 4, it turns into real money. Or, oh, I'm going to save $800 next year if my community does this. And we now have people that say, oh, if you live in the county, you're saving $800, but if you live in a city, they're not getting as much. So they start pushing the cities to do more. So it's really turned into a little internal competition amongst local governments down here. And I'm just saying that we are the highest. I'm going to turn it over to Emily. Say it again, Isabel.
Who's competing? No one, yeah. So,
Our county does.
We're competing.
that's great.
So I'm going to turn it over to Emily because she really worked on some regulatory changes and those threshold items that Lori talked about earlier. If you don't meet those thresholds, you cannot get higher in standing.
Thanks, Christine. I'm Emily Skemper. I'm the Senior Director of Planning and Environmental Resources. I've been working here since about 2012, so I've been able to watch the evolution of the flood program in Monroe County, even though it's not my primary focus. But our flood staff works under the building department, but our local floodplain regulations are within the county's land development code. So that falls under my responsibility, and my department supported the flood efforts in dealing with local code, policy changes, and all of that. After Hurricane Irma in 2017, we were faced with a lot of damage to manufactured homes. So we really had to dig in and figure out how to, the repair and replacement codes, local codes, federal codes, everything worked together. Who would be required to elevate their structures if they previously weren't above flood, et cetera. And related to CRS, in order to get from a class 5 to a class 4, one of the prerequisites is that the county's code must not allow any structures to be built below the required flood zone elevation. And although this was generally true, our county code did have one exception in a certain zoning category that some manufactured homes could just elevate on 36-inch piers rather than all the way up to their required base flood elevation. So we had to amend the code to remove that exception if we wanted to get to class 4. Of course, this affected a certain number of properties and homeowners, so we had to sort of tread lightly and figure out how to present this. We did, what you see on the screen here is we did a detailed analysis to quantify the impact on property owners before we presented that at public hearings and to our board. We made a map series that looked at how many of these manufactured homes were still only elevated to 36 inches, how many met the code's criteria for keeping them at 36 inches, and how many would already be required to elevate to base flood under the county's current code. So what we found, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a map that has little black dots. We made a map series and showed, based on our best estimates, we actually only found about 40 properties in the county that elimination of this exception would affect them. The other properties were either already elevated or would be required to elevate anyways next time they made repairs to their homes. So that was really helpful in putting this necessary policy change in perspective compared to the greater benefit of reaching that better CRS class rating. And it helped address concerns by property owners and also elected officials who were worried about the impact that would have on our current homeowners. And that's just one example of how our different departments work together for the CRS criteria. And I believe it's either Rhonda or Aaron is going to start talking about watershed management. This is our sustainability department, who also has taken on an integrated approach to looking at the CRS requirements.
So I remember the first time I met Lori Lear, Aaron Beatty, consultant for the county. We were on a call and we were trying to figure out how to move this watershed management plan concept forward. But Rhonda and I had just been awarded a NOAA grant, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to do a bunch of work on trying to better integrate resiliency and the community rating system program. So it all kind of landed at the right time. So CRS allows you to do a watershed management plan, but the trick was that Monroe County did not fit that kind of definition of a traditional watershed to be able to conduct a model and get output and kind of move forward. So Lori spent a lot of time working with FEMA to define what a watershed management plan would have to entail for an island chain 100 miles long. Next slide, Emily. And so in further conversations with FEMA regarding their requirements for a watershed management plan, we were advised by NOAA that we would have to use the NOAA intermediate high sea level rise projections. And not only that, we would have to model all the way out to the 2100 condition. Now, this was a little nerve-wracking for some communities that hadn't modeled sea level rise impacts that far out into the future. But luckily, the Southeast Regional Climate Compact had been doing their thing with unified sea level rise projections, and it wasn't that much of a lift to be able to add that increment of modeling into a watershed management plan effort. And so this was not a discretionary type of modeling run or scenario. This was something that CRS has required to participate in the program through a watershed management plan. Next slide. And that is an image of our beautiful watershed management plan, which was adopted by the commission, which has to be adopted by resolution, and that was adopted in August 2019. Just so you know what that entails, the watershed management plan in itself is about 300 pages long, about 100 pages of text, and about 200 pages of maps. Next one, Emily. And so this is an example of what some of our model output. The trick was that Monroe County had not done a stormwater master plan since 2001. So there was not a lot of data available about stormwater structures, how they would function, and their points of failure, meaning you would have to undertake an effort to generate elevation data related to those structures. And so what we did is we developed low and high conditions to determine at low tide and high tide when those stormwater management facilities would potentially lose functionality or fail. And I know this is like one of Christine's favorite slides from our watershed management plan, because it really provides a lot of information about your infrastructure and when the impacts of sea level rise will overcome those structures. Next slide. And so there were 4 main recommendations out of the watershed management plan. Some of those were already being undertaken by the county. Some are facilitating new direction, a constant update of data. Rhonda's going to talk a little bit about what more was entailed in the collection of that data. The county is now embarking on its roads and stormwater process, which Rhonda will talk about that in some subsequent slides, but really figuring out how you're going to have to design your infrastructure going forward, knowing what you know about sea level rise impacts and the functionality. And then finally, policy integration. And I think this is you, Rhonda.
Okay, good afternoon. This is Rhonda Haig, Chief Resiliency Officer with Monroe County. So I know we have a lot of cities on the line, and perhaps you're just starting out with your resiliency planning, whether you're doing it yourself or you hired consultants to help you start your resilience planning, whether it's vulnerability assessments or climate action plans. A lot of this type of information is going to be helpful. So even if you haven't started your CRS program yet, know that anything you do is going to be, a lot of it's going to be transferable to the CRS program. Next. So step 1 is, before you can start with anything on your resiliency planning, you have to know what you don't know. And how you do that is you analyze everything that you've done in your city or county and determine where the gaps are. And when we did that, I think that's maybe the next one. When we did that in Monroe County, we kind of looked at everything and we found out where a lot of our gaps were, especially with our roads program. We didn't know how high they were. So we had some LIDAR on hand, but it was aerial flown, it wasn't mobile flown. So we knew that it wasn't very accurate. That's just kind of like an example. Then you have to determine, when you know what your data gaps are, you have to determine which tools are going to help you answer those and fill those gaps and pose for impacts to what's going to be your county or city infrastructure. And then you have to move forward. Step 2, go ahead and collect the data. And there's a lot of different tools. If there's one thing I learned out there, is a lot of different tools that you can use to collect your data, whether it's for roads, water, wastewater, buildings, and habitat. So there's no one overall tool. That's why it's handy to use consultants to help you select your tools and help you gather that data. And that will save you a lot of time. Step 3, next. And then you gotta, once you collect it, of course, you gotta analyze it. What do you do with it now? Like what we did with our mobile LiDAR, we transferred that to our engineering firm, and they combined that with the climate projections, the sea level rise projections from the compact, and they're undergoing a roads elevation plan. So it's very useful. You just have to have the correct data, and you have to know how to analyze it. I'll have to tell you a funny little story. When we were out there collecting the mobile lidar, I'm not a mobile lidar expert, and that's a very geeky type of field. So when all this information was coming in, it was all this stuff in what's called the point cloud. I had no idea how to read mobile lidar, or how to look at survey data, or how to look at these point clouds with billions of points of light in them. So, you know, I hired a consultant who then did spot checks on that mobile lidar data. He would go in there and look at it, and if there wasn't something right, then, you know, let me know, and we let the mobile lidar data collector know what he had to change. So you have to know when to ask for help if you don't understand everything that's being collected. And don't be afraid to ask for help. It's important. Next. Step 4. And then finally, you can confirm to use your best tools. I think I kind of talked about that already. It's very specific to what fits you. So what maybe fits Monroe County isn't going to fit, you know, Delray Beach or the Regional Planning Council or another city somewhere. It's going to be very specific to what you're facing and what your situation is. Next slide. Okay, so here's what we've been involved. Is this where you jump in, Aaron? Or am I doing this? I'm doing it. Okay, so we've been involved in this. I was actually hired a decade ago. I just had my 10-year anniversary under one of the Obama grants, where we were doing a lot of planning, the EECBG energy grants, where I was hired, and they created a position, and that's when Monroe County started moving forward. So we've been at this for 10 years, and you know, we didn't have anything done back then. So we started small, and we of course applied for grants. Lisa here and Aaron were here, and they applied for that ECG-BG energy grant and got the grant that then hired me. So what you need to do is, you know, use grants as much as you can. There's a lot of good resources out there. The state has a lot of grant potential that you can apply for to help fund your work. Next. And then in year 2012, we did the energy and climate element in our comprehensive plan. We did our greenhouse gas reduction analysis. We created our initial climate action plan under using the climate compacts, regional climate action plan next year. Go ahead, next one. 2013, then we, you know, they did our own climate action plan. Then that's when I solicited to do a sustainability and resilience action plan. Then the following year, we went ahead and completed that. We did all, this is where we did the real heavy duty modeling. Because we finally figured out, thanks to our consultants' help, what we knew, what we didn't know. So then we had to do a series of data collection. That's where we did our vulnerability analysis, and I know a lot of cities are in that right now. Started doing our sea level rise modeling for 2030 and 2060 and some outreach. And then finally in year, next one, 2015, then we started moving forward. So we had next one more push. And finalized our green keys, and then when I do a plan, I like to do projects. So we had a 5-year plan in there with 165 projects, and we're right in the middle of implementing that out. So we haven't finished them all, but we're a good portion of the way through, and it really helps to have an action plan when you're doing these, whatever kind of plan you're doing, climate plan or resilience plan, and have a budget that you check off every year, because that's what I submit when I request my budget. I pull the projects right out of the plan and I put them in my budget, and I say, here's what we need for this year. Next, please. And so a lot of this effort, as I told you, there was 165 recommendations in our Green Keys plan, and that included amendments to our comprehensive plan to deal with climate change. You know, Monroe County is one of the more vulnerable, you're going to hear about it a little bit, and one of the most vulnerable areas in the country. We're so vulnerable to sea level rise because we're, you know, we're an island community and we're at or near sea level rise. So we have a lot of headway to make, and we're already doing that. And by, you know, we have some pilot road elevation projects that are underway. We improved our elevation data. That's where we did the mobile lidar, and now we're underway with the engineering analysis. And we added in an energy and climate element of the comp plan. Next. We're underway with our pilot road elevation projects. They're already designed, and we're just waiting to construct them. And finally, our, you know, mobile lidar is already done. Next. 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 Oh. Okay, and then Aaron, I think this is where you jump in.
Sure. So the county is in the midst of a road adaptation plan. Rhonda's going to talk a little bit more about that. And really creating from the ground up a process to prioritize and fund road retrofits, elevations, stormwater functionality, stormwater structures that have never been there before. It's really coming up with a wholesale plan to focus on transportation resiliency. We're also in the midst of updating right now the county's vulnerability assessment. That will be out the door, I believe, by Friday of this week. And so we're using a lot of the new data that has been developed over time into that vulnerability assessment update. Emily will talk more about this, but there's also integration with the comprehensive plan. As Rhonda talked about, the county undertook an effort to create an optional element of the comprehensive plan, energy and climate. Parallel flood amendments have been drafted at this point, and there's other work that can be done in the comp plan to integrate these policies and strategies into the county's growth strategy for the long run. And I believe that puts us back to another speaker.
So this pretty much shows our target that we talked about earlier, and how we went through the various steps to get to the score we are now. As stated, to go from a class 5 to a class 4 is really when the threshold items come into play, even bigger than in the other categories. And you just heard those threshold items that were really hard to accomplish for us. We were lucky in that Lori Lear, in her work with the CRS and the ISO, the people that grade us, we ended up with more points than we anticipated, and we actually achieved a higher class than we set out to achieve. And what that means is that we are saving our folks more money annually. And if you look at the accumulated savings, if we add those up since we started, we have saved over $22 million for our policyholders. And then each year we will save another 5.5 million. We are on hold right now for trying to go farther. While Lori and I have talked about, wouldn't that be amazing? We think we need to put a little bit of a hold on things and make sure we have our house in order, because you do receive community assistance visits, and they will come and look at your progress and make sure that you are actually achieving and implementing the programs you told them you're doing to get these points. So that's where we are now, and we're super excited about the progress that we've made. Emily?
I'm Lisa Tennyson. I am Monroe County's Director of Legislative Affairs. Maintaining NFIP's ability to continue to provide affordable flood insurance is a perennial legislative issue for Monroe County's commission. So we pay very close attention to it. The National Flood Insurance Program faces continual pressure to increase its premiums, which is why our efforts to bolster the CRS discounts become even more important and valuable to our constituents. As the programmatic context for CRS, I'm just going to briefly recap the NFIP. So Florida has the most policies. Over a third of all NFIP policies in the country are in Florida. So our state is the most impacted by any changes that happen to the program, particularly changes in premiums. NFIP is authorized or renewed by Congress every 5 years. And it's during this reauthorization period where Congress has the opportunity to make changes to the program. The last major legislative changes to the NFIP were back in 2012 with the passage of the Biggert Waters Act. And then in 2014, they stepped up with the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act. And HIFIA, the acronym for that last act, rolled back a lot of the most dramatically negative provisions in bigger orders, but it did create significant glide paths for annual increases that we operate with today, which are 18% annual increases for primary homes and a 25% annual increased glide path for commercial properties and second homes. Changes to the National Flood Insurance Program are generally controversial, and so they're hard for Congress. And so Congress really hasn't revisited a long-term reauthorization of NFIP since bigger waters. Instead, they've been reauthorizing NFIP through short-term extensions, 6 months or a year, and we've had about 17 extensions so far, and the current one gets us through September 2021. So we'll have to see a reauthorization, either a short-term extension or a long-term reauthorization effort, hopefully this summer. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So ironically, one of the most significant, if not the most significant impacts or changes to NFIP since its inception is risk rating 2.0. It hasn't even been legislated by Congress. This is one that's been just driven by the agency itself, which is FEMA. So risk rating 2.0 is FEMA's new method for assessing the flood risk for insured properties within the program. FEMA states that the purpose of risk rating 2.0 is to more accurately capture true risk of properties and then to be able to assign a more accurate insurance cost based on that more accurate risk assessment. Risk rating 2.0 will be a much more granular approach than what they're using right now, and it will look at the specific features of individual properties and their exact location. Currently, FEMA looks at base flood elevation using elevation certificates. It looks at what flood zone the property's in, and for flood risk, it uses the 1% chance of flooding, the 100-year storm. Risk rating 2.0 will look at several additional factors. First, it's going to look at elevation, not based on an elevation certificate, but its own internal data. It's going to look at the structure's specific construction and foundation type. It's going to look at the cost to rebuild that structure. And for flood risk, it's going to look at how close a property is to the coast or a river, and the propensity of the property to experience extensive rainfall and storm surge. And these are not risk criteria that will favor Florida's coastal communities. FEMA will begin implementing risk rating 2.0 this year. In October 2021, it will start implementing it for new policies, and in April of next year for existing policies. FEMA has attempted to roll out 2.0 several times over the past couple of years, but delayed that, and some suspect it's because it will not be well received when it's implemented. We still have yet to really know this because FEMA hasn't yet released specific enough data to tell us which properties will be impacted and how the premiums for those properties will be impacted. What they have released is state level data, and this chart reflects the data that comes right from FEMA. In fact, the spreadsheet and this chart are FEMA's products. And this is FEMA's information for risk rating 2.0 in Florida. And according to FEMA's information in Florida, about 200,000 policies will see increased premiums. About 340,000 policies will see decreases in premiums, and about 1.1 million will stay the same or have annual increases of $120 a year or less. The semi-good news is that new premiums still will not be allowed to exceed the statutory 18 and 25% increases on their premiums. However, even with those glide paths, you have to remember that premiums will essentially double every 5 years. The good news, though, really is that CRS discounts will continue to apply to all policies. So the more those premiums go up, the more valuable that discount will be. Next slide. Oh, wait. So this is just a slide that reminds us all about how much Florida has at stake. We have the most policies, but even within the state of Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Monroe have the most policies. I mean, Monroe doesn't have the most policies per se because of our size, but we do have the most policies covered by NFIP. So we really are essentially the counties with the most at stake in the state with the most at stake. So CRS discounts are, just going to be ever more important for us. Next slide. All that we've talked about so far really takes money. This is a challenge for local governments as we try to implement these resilience planning and projects. And it is important for us to find and locate and identify money outside our local communities to help. And so I'm just going to summarize here some of those opportunities for funding. FEMA has a suite of programs, the pre-disaster mitigation program, it's now called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. It has the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The first two are available before a disaster. Hazard mitigation is available after a disaster. Also worth noting is HUD's CDBG, disaster recovery, and CDBG mitigation funding. These are also post-disaster funding available after a presidentially declared disaster, and they are intended to obviously help with recovery in a community post-disaster. But it is important to know that you can, when you're building back infrastructure, when you're building back retrofits and adaptation, you can use the money, these sorts of funding in your recovery to bring that new, higher, stronger, better infrastructure into your recovery with that funding. And Monroe County certainly has made a lot of use out of that funding. At the state level, some good things have happened this year at the state in Tallahassee. The passage of SB 1954, HB 7019 is the major climate change bill that was passed by the legislature this year. It basically, recognizes the state's increased vulnerability to sea level rise and flood risk. It creates a new grant program. It's a 50-50 match program with local governments to help fund new resilience planning and projects. It'll be run under the Department of Environmental Protection. Importantly, the bill authorizes $100 million annually for the grant program. And it also directs a bunch of new money. Florida got an infusion of American Rescue Plan dollars into the state, and the legislature allocated $500 million from that ARP funding toward this new program. So it basically has about $600 million in its pot for resilience. Not bad. Worthy of mentioning also was an effort that happened in Tallahassee this year, also happened last session, and is likely to be repeated. And that is a bill that would give counties the option to redirect a portion of their tourist development taxes towards flood mitigation needs, something to look out for in future sessions. Obviously the passage of SB 1954 is a positive step for Florida. The $600 million is good, although really it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we actually face in cost to mitigate risk in our respective communities. Alone, Monroe County, even unincorporated Monroe County, our road elevation flood mitigation programs approach an estimate of $2 billion. That's just unincorporated Monroe County, not even the cities. And really, what does that tell us? I mean, the Florida legislature and the local communities are all going to need to continue to grapple with ways to raise the necessary revenues for these flood mitigation projects. In our own local attempt to find mitigation revenues, Monroe County went to Tallahassee this year and sought legislative authority to levy an additional sales tax for our flood mitigation projects, subject, of course, to coming back home and doing a local referendum. But those revenues would have been dedicated solely to road elevation and flood mitigation projects. And I say dedicated because, of course, we were not successful, but we will continue to try because really we have to continue to try. One of the additional benefits, and this is, I want to mention, of implementing, or levying a sales tax, particularly in high tourism counties, and we all are high tourism counties, is that much of the funding that's raised by a sales tax comes from tourists. In Monroe County, over 60% of the revenue from a sales tax comes from tourists and not the local communities. But no current funding source is sufficient, and no single source is going to be either. We're really going to need to consider multiple funding sources as we move forward. Florida is the third largest state in the county, And we're a peninsular state surrounded by water on all 3 sides. Half of our counties are coastal. 80% of our GDP is generated in these coastal counties. And so, we try to make the argument to Tallahassee that investing in our resilience is an investment in the state's economic health. And then, of course, enhanced resilience also just reduces risk, protects people and property, and of course, lowers insurance costs. Next slide.
Next slide. So all of our speakers have made some really important points about, resiliency planning or even CRS participation is not a one and done thing. It is a continual effort. So Lori's going to be around for quite some time, continuing to work on keeping the county in the CRS program and potentially improving participation at some point. But as Lisa mentioned, there are a lot of other things that are going on at the same time while you're doing your resiliency planning. Rhonda touched on the constant improvement of collection, improvement of data, and the watershed management plan kind of helped us understand that, not having stormwater information, not having the elevation data. Now the county has that. And then being able to integrate this into the comprehensive plan in a holistic way, not just in one element of the comprehensive plan, in multiple elements of the comprehensive plan where appropriate. It makes sense to do it, not just the coastal element throughout the comp plan. Lisa's talked about funding. We're seeing new funding streams coming up while we're doing this resiliency and floodplain management planning. The other thing is tracking other initiatives that are going on right now. The state is very close to concluding rulemaking from, I believe it was Senate Bill 178 last year, requiring sea level impact projection studies for any project that's going to receive $1 of state funds. And so what's interesting about that rulemaking is, once again, they are mandating the use of the NOAA intermediate high sea level rise projection. This is something that the state has made a very significant effort to do, is standardize the type of data that they are receiving from local governments that are receiving grant dollars and are undertaking vulnerability assessments. The other thing that we know, as Lisa talked about House Bill 7019, if you want to receive grant funding out of that program to conduct a vulnerability assessment, guess what? You're going to have to use that NOAA intermediate high sea level rise projection again. So now we have the state essentially saying, if you want $1 of state money, guess what? You're going to do this in a standardized way. So we are collecting the data from the local governments in a uniform manner. And so this is not a one and done effort. As I've said, you're going to have to keep on top of these things and know what's going on also at the state level. And I think the next slides are you, Emily.
Yes, so as part of this aligned effort, I wanted to talk about that shared data and how that's going to play into an upcoming comprehensive plan policy, potential change to our policies or addition to our policies. As Rhonda and Aaron mentioned, the vulnerability assessment is currently being updated for county assets like habitat, buildings, infrastructure. And that vulnerability assessment data is critical information needed to develop policies and programs that prioritize interventions and address the specific needs of Monroe County. So the grant funding we received to update the vulnerability assessment also included tasks to develop draft adaptation action areas and the associated policies for such areas. Our comprehensive plan includes a climate and energy element, and that specifically states that the county will look at adopting these adaptation action areas into our comp plan and code. Adaptation action areas are a fairly new planning tool established in Florida statute. It's those areas that experience coastal flooding due to extreme high tides and storm surge, and that are vulnerable to the related impacts of rising sea levels. And we can look at these for specific policy initiatives for the purpose of prioritizing funding for infrastructure needs and for adaptation planning. Here, I just wanted to show a few different types of adaptation strategies. So you can look at protection, which is to implement structurally defensive measures that protect vulnerable structures, allowing them to stay in the place that they are and be left largely unaltered. The second is accommodation. So that's to alter the physical design of the structures and where they can stay in place without mitigation efforts around them in the land around them. 3 is retreat. So that's in areas where protection or accommodation are not available. You can choose to pull those assets out of those vulnerable areas. And then number 4 is avoidance. That involves guiding new development away from the areas that are subject to the coastal hazards. So these policies can be adopted to encourage that in terms of private owned land, et cetera, but also to require it in terms of government owned land. Some of our potential approaches, and these our real approaches are going to be driven by the data. So Aaron mentioned that data is kind of coming out of the hopper on Friday this week. So we don't know yet exactly what our policy approaches are going to be, but some ideas that we've had and ideas from other communities that have already worked on their adaptation action areas are increased structure elevation, open space, setbacks, stormwater retention. We have a permit process where we have to allocate a limited number of permits for residential development. We have a cap on residential growth. So it's a point system, and we could offer negative points for vulnerable locations that would disincentivize building in those areas. Targeted acquisition areas, infrastructure improvements, really focusing on funding priorities based on what's needed for infrastructure. Increased habitat protections. We have to consider that habitats may transition due to sea level rise. Shoreline stabilization. So we have some restrictions on how and where you can stabilize your shoreline today. We may need to look at that for specific areas of the county and allow maybe more increased seawall height or more hardening under certain criteria though. Roadway elevation, which Rhonda and Aaron are going to talk about a little more, and then also maybe some financial incentives, maybe individual grant programs for homeowners to encourage resilient construction in those adaptation action areas.
Okay, so when we assembled this slideshow for you, Isabel said she would like us to provide a little bit of update on what Monroe County is doing in the Keys to prepare to be resilient. So we're going to have a little fun now and show you what's going on with our roadway vulnerability study, which is really what roads we're going to elevate and when. So why is the urgency? So you ought to know, if you're living anywhere in South Florida, you've got to have to see us in the news. We're well known. This is from the New York Times. Whoops, go back this one. Back up. So we've been in the New York Times. You know, we have some issues with our services. One more. Even in these fall king tides here, we have issues with our postal service and other community services getting through when we have these amazingly high fall tides. And so we have, they started out several years ago. Next slide. But it really hit home back in 2015. This is a neighborhood in Key Largo, Still Right Point. They were under 85 days of some varying levels of water, probably varied from a couple of inches to 1.5 feet or more for a couple of months at a time. Now, if you're pulling through up to your house and that driving through that amount of salt water, probably not going to want to take your brand new Mercedes-Benz through that amount of water, especially salt water. So the residents understandably aren't happy. This is another neighborhood, Twin Lakes. That's actually one of our pilot road elevation programs where we've already done the design. We're actually just finishing up the design and we're looking for grant funds to fund that construction of the elevation. And then finally, there's one on Big Pine. And that's a key deer. That's not a canal. That's walking through one of the roads. So we have widespread king tide flooding already. We don't have to wait for the water to come. It already found us, especially in October, November, and a little bit December, and then again in the spring. And every year that I've been here over the last 10 years, it gets higher and higher and more widespread throughout the Keys. So we have to do something. So we started our planning 10 years ago. Next slide. So here's what we're looking at. We use, of course, the projections from the Climate Compact. We're using the NOAA Intermediate High, just like Aaron said, because these are roadway projects and they're relatively long lasting, 20, 25 years or more. So that is the NOAA High, Intermediate High is the projection that we have to use. So starting from today, here's what we're looking at in terms of water. We're looking at 13 inches increase. That's a foot and a more by 2045. That's not very far away. And then another 11 inches added onto that by 2060, and then by 2100, it's a whopping 43 more inches for a total of almost, next slide, almost 6 feet in the next 80 years. Now, hopefully, will be wrong. And, hopefully all the greenhouse gas initiatives that you see the world undertaking, not just counties and cities, but the world and other countries and private industries, maybe we can help slow down the greenhouse gas reduction rate, and maybe help the ice cap stop melting so fast. That's all hopeful, but we can't plan on that. So we have to plan now, because like I said, we're already seeing the seas rise. People are already driving through all this salt water in the fall king tides, and it won't be long before they're going to have that level of water on their roads year round in some of the lower places. Next. So here's just kind of I wanted to show you what it really looks like. This is one of our roads down in Sugarloaf. So by the year 2025, which is what, 4 years away, we're already looking at, in the fall king tide season, we're looking at water up to the sides of the road for 2-3 months of the year. So this is what you're going to be seeing as you drive through in October and November. And then you see that little red on the left, even year-round sea level rise. It's starting to creep up there onto the shoulders of the road. So, it's already kind of a mangrove-y type of place, but now it almost looks like a canal. Now what? Let's press the next slide and see what that looks like. So this is year 2045. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't want to drive through that. That's salt water. That's now over a half a foot of king tide water on the streets for that 2-3 month period in the fall. And now you see the red. Now that year-round sea level rise is a half a foot. It's creeping up to the sides of the pavement. So it's like, oh my goodness. So even when they're not during the king tide season, you have sea level rise creeping up to the edges of the road. And of course, that's gonna really could undermine that road. If once it's wet for long periods of time, your road starts to wash out. So these are just some kind of related problems related to it. Now let's jump to the next one. 2060. Oh, now you're looking at almost 1.5 feet of king tide on that road during the fall season, during the October, November. And now even look at that red line, sea level rise. Now you got constant sea level rise even down there across that road the entire year. And so these are the type of problems that we're facing here in the Keys. And so we have to plan now. I don't know about you, but I don't want to wait until the water is that high in front of my house. I want the county to do their planning ahead of time and make sure that there's a plan in place so that we can beat the water before it gets from that. The county elevates the roads before the water arrives in that kind of quantity. Even our residents now that just see the couple of inches or 2-3 inches on the roads during the fall tides, they're not happy about it either. And I get it, because it is salt water and it does affect their ability to get to their house. But when it's 1.5 feet or more, that's a lot of water. And it's just not something we want to see in the county. Next. So here's a neighborhood. Here's kind of another way of looking at it, how the projected water levels throughout the county. So this is just the sea level rise condition. Again, using the NOAA intermediate high tide. You can see there in 2035, you're now looking at 2 feet of depth of water. And so you might be your house might be elevated, but if your road is underwater, it's like, not so sure I want to live there anymore. Now look at 2045, you're looking at 2.5 feet of water there. You see how his entire yard is now underwater? So just because we even elevate that road isn't going to stop the water from coming into the yards. We might get into a little bit more conversation on that in a minute. And then 2060, now we're looking at 3.5 feet. So now you have a swimming pool around your house year round. So these are the kind of situations that we're going to face here in the Keys to some level or another. And that's why we have this countywide road elevation study underway. Next slide. So what's it going to do? What's going to tell us we have 311 miles of roads that we maintain in the county. And by the way, this is only unincorporated Monroe, doesn't include the municipalities yet. We're trying to bring them along, trying to help them do their mobile lighter and their planning. But right now it's just unincorporated Monroe. So it's going to tell us which roads need to be elevated, when, and how high. And so they're preparing some conceptual designs of roadways. And when you elevate a roadway, you have to make it not only higher, but wider. When you start making it wider, you start maybe going in on, might use some front yards because maybe there's not enough room there to make a wider road. So now we have to borrow or get access to neighbors' front yards and use those. And if you want to make it walkable, people like to walk their dogs. We have a lot of Keys are big walkable neighborhoods. Going to have to make it wider. There might not be room there to make it wider. So where are people how they're going to bike or ride or walk or any of those type of things? So these are a lot of the issues that we're looking at. What do you do with the electrical poles that are there? Utility impacts, we're going to have to raise poles. What do you do with mailboxes? Driveways. These are all different types of things that are going to be affected. And the big thing is your collection of the water on the road. So that's what this plan is doing. It's looking at all these different types of improvements. Next. Next. So we presented this a couple of months ago to our county commission. So out of our 311 miles of roads, by the year 2045, 49%, so you might as well say half of them will be vulnerable to some level of sea level rise. And not only that, we looked at not only the miles of roads, we looked at how many people live on there. And so that's 71% of our residential units are on those roads. So might only be half our roads, but it's 71% of our population. Then by 2060, the number jumps to 66% of the roads. And then by 2100, it jumps up to, next one more push, it jumps up to 81%. And so you can see out of our 300 miles of roads, we had a lot of work to do in the next 25 years. That's half our roads. So it doesn't mean they all need to be elevated right away. That's basic. That's why we're doing this study, so we know what to spend now. But as you already heard, for the next 25 years, to get us through the year 2045, we're looking at about $1.8 billion in road elevation spread throughout the next 25 years in unincorporated Monroe only. So we have a little bit of a challenge ahead of us to try to fund all of this fun work. Next. One more. There we go. So we have a lot of residents asking, they see that $1.8 billion price tag and they get all nervous, like, oh, we don't want taxes, we don't want taxes. So they say, just throw us a couple of inches of asphalt on our road in front of our house and be done with it. Well, that doesn't necessarily work. I want to push a couple and next I'll show you why. First of all, when you do that, you have to make sure that, this will be actually a good one for Aaron to pop in here. When you do that, you have to make sure that we're not negatively affecting the neighbor's property. So if we're just putting blacktop on and now water's running, we don't put any drainage system in or anything to capture the water that's falling on the road, guess what? It's going to fall off the road and it's going to go into people's yards and flood their yards. And then what? Then the county gets sued. So we can't get permits to do that because it's not legal. You have to be able to get a permit for the type of work you do. And that's minimum short-term benefits. If we had 4 or 5 inches of blacktop, it's only gonna last a number of years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. And then we gotta pour more good money on top of that, what we already spent. And like I talked about, we already talked about the potential for private flooding, private property flooding. And then if you don't do the drainage features and saltwater flooding is still gonna come in. You see that red line there? Look to the left of that vertical red line. That's private property. So even though we might elevate that road 4 or 5 inches, doesn't mean the sides of the road aren't still flooding. So you still got to drive through the water. And now your roadway is going to continue to deteriorate because it's still seeing a lot of water continuously on it for months, weeks, or months at a time. And then flooding is just going to get worse and worse as we go along. And as the underground water rises, then your French drain system isn't going to work either. So now it's like, where's all the water going to go? It's just going to sit there. And that's exactly what this short-term solution will not work. Next. And then when you're looking at these type of parcels, if you look at, this is that neighborhood in Key Largo. So as I told you, even if we elevate the roads, it isn't going to stop the water from coming in. The water doesn't know that it's still going to go around wherever it can go. So you see those blue arrows? That's where the water is already coming in. And it's, by the year 2045, it's continued. But now as the seas rise, it's going to come in more places. Maybe the lots that aren't quite as low, it's not going to come in those lots. That's where you see the yellow line by 2045. So now it looks like you double the amount of water that's coming in, plowing into the private yards. And now look at 2045, the red. Now you tripled it. They got water all over the place. So these are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at in Monroe County. It's like, well, what do we do with all the water that's coming into the yards? And that's where the policies are going to really be important in our commissioners' discussion. Are we going to allow everybody 75,000 yards to fill in their backyards? Are we going to fill them up? Are we going to put seawalls in to stop the water? Well, we're in a national marine sanctuary. So there's a lot of really delicate, important decisions and discussions that our lucky 5 commissioners are going to be having over the next 4 or 5 years. Right, Mayor? So I think, Aaron, is this where you jump in or?
Yeah, I mean, Rhonda's last slide where it showed the blue, the red, and the yellow arrows is really important because it demonstrates the concept that the local government can undertake an adaptation planning program for its infrastructure and its assets and resources and that type of thing, but it's not going to stop the fact that sea level rise is still going to impact people's private properties. And that's why the policy piece that Emily talked about earlier in terms of adaptation action areas is so important. So you've got to have both sides of the equation. You've got to have a plan for countywide or local government adaptation that's going to deal with your roads, your buildings, your infrastructure, that type of thing. But you also have to undertake some type of policy development to deal with the fact that private property is going to be flooded too. Are you going to allow people to put more fill on their property? Are you going to incentivize them to elevate their structures? Are you going to incentivize them or create design standards for elevated driveways? We may have situations where the road gets elevated, the driveway gets elevated, the house is elevated on piers, yet the yard may be continually inundated. Some people may want to live like that. Some people may not want to live like that. But you need both the public sector and the private sector adaptation to truly achieve resilience. Next slide. And so it's like anything, when you start down this kind of planning process, as Rhonda mentioned before, you don't always know what you don't know. And there are challenges along the way. For instance, we have generated a memorandum on knowing where the remaining growth in the county is potentially going to go, because those people are going to demand urban levels of service or the highest level of service that they potentially can get. Level of service issues. Not everybody's going to get the same level of service in terms of road elevation and flood mitigation. How do you deal with that in terms of assessment structures when not everybody, they may be paying an assessment fee or a user fee, but they may not end up with the same level of service. So we've looked at other case studies, not something we deal with a lot in South Florida, obviously, but in New England and other parts where they get a lot of snow, people's roads aren't plowed 365 days a year, especially after a blizzard event. You know, so there are differing levels of service. Road maintenance, this is a big one. In terms of your comprehensive plan also, I guarantee all of you, if you look through your comprehensive plan, you are going to find policies that essentially say, we're going to maintain a certain level of service. Guess what? In the future with sea level rise, you may not be able to maintain that level of service. So you should go back, a little free legal advice here. You should probably go back and look at those policies within your comprehensive plan where you're making those commitments, because you may not be able to meet them in the future. You may have to invoke some policies that are a little bit more reality based, that you may just be maintaining infrastructure, not necessarily enhancing it or improving it. And then Lisa talked a little bit about funding. We've looked at a lot of case studies across the country on how they've been funding resiliency work. Next slide. And so I talked a little bit about, you know, the public sector approach, the private sector approach, or things that may fall into either category. And there are different ways that you would implement policies to deal with that. For instance, Rhonda's project that she talked about with the roads and the flood mitigation, there could be policies in the comprehensive plan, design standards in the code. There may be local government funding, but there also may be private property owner funding through assessments or other user fees, or the establishment of some type of new utility. Same type of thing with private property. The local government may not be helping private property owners, but there may be an assessment structure that could do the same type of thing. Next slide. And then finally, I'm not going to go through all this. We've talked a little bit about what the county's done already, but Isabel, obviously you have a copy of the presentation. This is a nice little hit list for local governments in terms of what the county's been doing. Next slide. And now we're in that row that's pink. We're updating the vulnerability assessment to have the best data that we possibly can, and we're creating example language for adaptation action areas. Next slide. And it takes all of these different pieces. One thing that we did not talk about so far were partnerships with the state government, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the South Florida Water Management District right now, and the Corps. For instance, relooking at the CNSF program and the functionality of those stormwater structures and secondary and tertiary drainage structures that depend on the functionality of the CNSF program. The South Florida Water Management District and USGS right now are working on a scope of work to understand the implications and the interrelationships between sea level rise and rainfall and what that means in terms of future climate change. Next slide. And this is just a little sample of some of our modeling output. Next click, Emily. This is Stock Island. We showed this to the Board of County Commissioners in the month of April as an update to the vulnerability assessment, and we've got better modeling data, and we're working on our output and getting our deliverable out on Friday. And I think this is the last slide. So maybe Lori, you want to take the CRS piece of this and Rhonda the other side.
So the key takeaways from what there are many, in fact, when we were talking about this slide, Emily mentioned that pretty much everything we talked about are key takeaways. These are the lessons that we've learned through this process. But on the CRS side, with the rising cost of flood insurance, Lisa did a really good job at sort of outlining that for us. This is still a vital piece of the services that you can offer. You can say to your constituents, this is how much you're saving. It's right here on your policy, and it is a percentage, so that's going to go up. And you can start by analyzing what you're doing in your community and see what you're doing in your current programs. A lot of what we got into in a class 6, we were already doing. We didn't add a lot to do that. You got to sell this participation. You really do have to sell it. It's just more and more on our staff, but what does that look like coming back to the community? And keep working on those programs, because as you've heard a lot about in the second part of the presentation, it does really result in a more resilient community and to find ways to be more resilient.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in here about resilience planning. So if you're sitting, you haven't started anything yet, and you heard about the 800 pages of CRS, don't get scared and run away. Start with something small. If you haven't started resiliency planning, start with that. Do a vulnerability assessment. Figure out what you don't know. Where's your data gaps? Where are your true vulnerability areas, in terms of sea level rise? State has a really generous grant program that funds a lot of this type of work. Just have to apply, and you have a pretty good chance of getting a grant. That's, we funded some of our beginning type of work with that. If you're already doing resiliency work, great. Then just keep moving forward. Take a look now, start peeking at the CRS requirements, and you'll see how some of that data is going to move over into the CRS program. And some of the stuff that you aren't doing that the CRS requires, you'll be able to more easily roll it out. But definitely the biggest thing of all is get yourself a Lori Lear, because you definitely is very, very helpful. Okay, that's all I have to say. Lori, you want to have anything else to say, anybody?
We'll let the mayor wrap this up, I believe.
Thank you, thank you. So as you can see in closing, this is a work in progress, and it takes a rock star team and a supportive board of county commissioners. And we really are throwing everything at this that we have, all ideas on how to raise the necessary funds, to improve our infrastructure, to all types of innovative engineering, to community buy-in, and from my end, the political will. So I want to thank my Rockstar team here today for all that they do to help keep the Florida Keys a viable place to live, work, play, and I thank all of you all here for participating today. And I think we left 1 minute for questions.
Well, I want to thank the mayor and all our panelists for the outstanding presentation. Again, a lot of information. I wish this were a little longer, but what we're going to do is please keep in contact with Aralda or myself. We will take your questions. We've already texted or emailed with Christine. We're going to send questions to Christine so she can answer them. And then we're going to go ahead and create a resource page where you'll find this presentation along with the questions and answers, as well as the link, Christine, that we had talked about before, the link to the Monroe County documents that Aaron spoke about and Rhonda spoke, everybody spoke about. So therefore, you'll have a complete bit of information, the presentation, questions and answers, and of course, we're always here to help. So, Aralda, did you want to say something before we go?
No, I just wanted to thank the panelists again. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us. And I hope that the audience found all this info as helpful as possible. And if you have any questions, just email me and I will connect you with the Monroe County staff if that's possible.
I'd like to thank Geralda for putting together this presentation with our council member and our guests. I think you did a great job, Geralda. Thank you. So,
Thank you. Well, with that said, I guess we can end the webinar, and thank you again, and have a lovely rest of the week.
thank you, everybody. It was fabulous.
All right.
Bye.